So welcome everyone. This is our 9th green quarantine here at the Broadway Green Alliance, which continues to be surreal. It is Thursday, our day of the week check, and we are still in the month of May. So this is our last May quarantine session. For those, I see a lot of familiar faces and I also see some new names. So welcome back to those who are joining us again. And if you are new here, we are the Broadway Green Alliance. And our mission is to motivate, educate, and inspire the entire theater community and its fans, patrons, to implement environmentally friendlier practices, which is what we will be tangibly doing today. I love that we will be working, I believe I will let Tim quote himself, but all about dirty hands today and actually getting our hands dirty and figuring out how we can implement some environmentally friendlier practices at home during this quarantine and going forward. And we have a very special guest, and there was a big popular demand to talk about compost. So I'm turning the session over to a compost expert, Tim Bennett, who is the founder and president of Bennett Compost. And I'm personally a member and a customer of Bennett Compost here in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we do not have municipality composting. Tim will obviously speak to that. And so Bennett Compost serves a huge purpose here in Philadelphia, allowing residents to compost safely and very easily using his service. And he is an expert, has been doing this for 11 years now. And I'm very excited to learn from you today, Tim. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us. So again, for those of you who are new, you can put your questions into the chat and we will address those as we go and primarily at the end. And otherwise, feel free to pin Tim's video so you can see it nice and big. You can do that using the 3 dots up in the corner of his video. And I'm excited. Take it away, Tim. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me and inviting me to talk. And thank you everyone who's here and interested in learning more. I really hope that you guys get a lot out of this, and we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can. So make sure you keep them coming, and Molly will moderate the questions and kind of get them to me. I'm a big believer in not holding all your questions to the end because I think that oftentimes we forget them. But we will try to do some coordination and get to them. And if we need to push off some till later on, we will. I'm going to just first give kind of some overview of both Bennett Compost, what we do and how we got started. So just because I know this is being recorded and there may be people who are watching it later who don't really care about all that part and just want to get to the how do I compost, they can probably skip the first 8 or 9 minutes of this video and go right to that part if you're watching in the future. But for all of you here, you'll have to put up with a little bit of backstory. But hopefully it'll give you some insight into why I have some answers, I think, to help you compost. So Bennett Compost is located here. We're in Philadelphia, and we serve people throughout Philadelphia to helping them compost, both households and businesses. We work with about 3,700 households throughout the city, doing pickups 5 days a week. And we also, pre-COVID, we were picking up from around 100 businesses. Obviously, we have had many of our, because those businesses are, a lot of them tend to be in restaurants and cafes and people who have food waste offices. Those have been shut down, and we're still picking up from about 20 who are doing, kind of takeout and curbside pickup, but we're doing a lot less of the kind of commercial business than we did beforehand. We're hopeful that those businesses, once we kind of get on the other side of things, are able to open and we're able to work with them. But so we handle all kinds of food from all kinds of customers. I started the business in 2009 and have been running it for the 11 years since then. When it started, it was just me, and now we have 10 full-time employees, myself included, who work here, and 5 part-time employees who work here. Everyone who works here makes at least $15 an hour, and then we also offer health insurance. We have a 401k, we do paid holidays, and we have sick and vacation time for employees. Because part of what we think is important about doing work in this field, in this space, and doing green work is also to make sure that we're not doing it in a way that takes advantage of the people who are working here. So we've always tried to balance that, and in addition to our mission, which is just to make composting as simple as we can for people here in Philadelphia. We collect, for some scale, we pick up around 60 tons each month from the households and the businesses that we work with. Pre-COVID, that was about a 50-50 split between businesses and households. During this time, we've actually seen a pretty noticeable uptick in the amount of material that we're collecting from households, and that's because people are home and they're cooking more, and they have more stuff to compost, which is nice and is made up for the decrease that we've seen in material that we're collecting from businesses. We compost about 20% of the material on site at our location in North Philadelphia, using a method called Aerated static pile method, which basically involves building large compost piles, covering them with, or compost piles where we're mixing everything together, covering it with a layer of finished compost, and we blow air into it using pipes that are attached to blowers on a regular basis. That's not a way that is really a way that you'll do it at home. It's more kind of a way that people do for larger scale composting. We're going to talk a lot about different ways that you can kind of compost at home. And when we started, we didn't do it that way. So we've got some experience in using smaller scale stuff. Additionally, we partner, so the rest of the material, we partner with, we have a public high school here in Philadelphia that actually has an agricultural focus. They are one of two high schools, public urban high schools in the country that have livestock still. So they have cows and they have pigs and they have sheep, and they're located within the boundaries of Philadelphia, and their kids are coming from all parts of the city, and they're definitely, you know, your regular Philadelphia public school kids, but they're working with these animals. And so because they have animals, they have manure that they have to deal with. And so they have a composting program there. So we partner with them to handle some of our material as well. We also work with an on-farm composter, excuse me, who's got a farm about 25 miles outside of Philadelphia. And that's where we process most of the commercial material that we collect. We allow kind of a wider range of materials in some of the commercial stuff that we collect from the home stuff. And so that requires kind of different ways of handling that. So that's kind of the backstory, or that's kind of an overview of where we are and what we do. A little bit quickly about kind of when we started. We started in 2009, and I started it because I had an idea. I wanted to compost. I was living in a second floor apartment at the time in South Philly. And I didn't have outdoor space, and I didn't have a backyard, but I wanted to compost. And had I attended a seminar or webinar like this, I would have learned about some options where you can compost even if you are in an apartment with no outside space. Oh, excuse me. But I didn't, and there was a little bit less kind of information about composting in general. And so I thought maybe there's someone I could take it to. Maybe there was someone who would collect it, and I didn't say anything like that. And it kind of got me thinking that maybe there was an idea, and maybe there was something there. I talked to some friends who were interested. So I put $100 in a bank account, and I said, I'm going to have this idea for a home collection service and see what happens. And if it probably won't go anywhere, but you know, if I lose $100, I've certainly spent $100 on less meaningful stuff in my life, and I'll probably waste a lot of time, but I've certainly wasted my share of time in my life. So either way, I'll probably learn something, and we'll see where it goes. And that's kind of what got started. And when we first started, we did all of our composting in partnership with very small community gardens here in Philadelphia. And these were gardens that sat right next to homes. And so we weren't collecting a lot of material, but we had to get very good at managing that material in a way that was appropriate, didn't generate smells, didn't attract, you know, vermin like mice or other rodents, or be kind of disruptive to neighborhoods. in any way. And I think a lot of what we learned there helped to make us better composters as we moved into doing things on a bigger scale, but it also gave me insight that I hope I can share with you today about how to manage smaller systems. And I have a picture here that I'm going to try to get on the screen for you to see so you get a sense of one of our earliest systems that we worked with. So I'm going to share my screen for a second, and then so this is me working in one of the very rudimentary systems that we developed in a garden. And where this overgrowth is, there are houses right on the other side of that. There are houses within probably 15 feet in any direction of where we're doing the actual composting. So it can be done in tight urban environments with a little bit of outside space. It can be done if you have a backyard. It can be done in an apartment too, which we'll certainly get to. So I'm gonna stop that and go back to this. So that's kind of how we got started. And as we've grown, we've modified the way we've done things and adjusted things appropriately. So I guess we should talk about what composting is. I assume that most people here kind of know what it is, but just in case they're not sure and they want some kind of background, that's why they're here. I don't want to make them feel too confused. So composting, we're talking about essentially taking food scraps and other what we're going to call organics. And organics doesn't mean organic like I got it from Whole Foods. It means organic like it came from a living creature, so a plant or an animal or something like that. So we call those, when we're composting, we call those organics, and we use the terms like source separated organics. So that means when people are separating those organics from their other trash and taking that material and making it into compost. And compost is basically something that you add to soil to make it, gives it a whole bunch of kind of wonderful qualities. It helps it retain water. It helps it to replenish both nutrients and also some of the microbiology that's in the soil that can be lost if you've been using it for other things. So it really kind of both does, it both reduces the amount of material that we're sending to landfills, and it also creates this beautiful product that you can use to grow food and flowers and all kinds of wonderful plants. And composting is important because, excuse me, because when we send food waste and other organics to landfills, they generate a lot of methane. And methane is a greenhouse gas, which doesn't get as much exposure as carbon dioxide, which everyone knows a lot about, but it's actually, we don't generate as much of it as carbon dioxide, but it's actually a more harmful greenhouse gas per kind of amount than carbon dioxide is. And believe it or not, landfills are the third largest contribution of methane to as a greenhouse gas in our emissions, after only energy production. And so a lot of that is if you're, mining if you're drilling for natural gas or other things, there's gases that are released. And the other one is agriculture, and that is primarily coming from the out of the mouths and out of the backsides of livestock. So those are the two biggest sources of methane emissions, but emissions from landfills are not far behind. And so that's, by reducing the amount of food waste and organics we're sending to landfills, we can cut down on those greenhouse gas emissions. We also create this wonderful amendment for soil that allows us to continue to use existing soil year after year after year without having to add chemical fertilizers and things of that nature. Because when you're growing stuff in the ground, or you're growing stuff in a pot or in any kind of soil, the plant uses the nutrients that are in the soil, and if it's not replenished, that soil will become unable to really grow things in the future without some kind of amendment, whether it's compost or whether it's some kind of other fertilizer that you would put in. Compost is technically different than a fertilizer, but for most people, getting too far into those technical difficulties unless you're more advanced, kind of down either the chemistry or the gardening phase. You can use, you can think of them as kind of interchangeably. You're adding it to the soils to kind of help them grow and so sorry, my screen just threw me off for a second. So those are kind of reasons why, people want to compost and people do composting, and there are lots of kind of different ways to kind of do it. And so I want to talk about that, but I don't know whether we've had any questions, or I want to kind of take a break if there's anything that people want to jump in and have me answer now. This is kind of a good transition point before I move into like, how can we start composting?
I think we're good to keep on going.
Perfect. Great. So really there are kind of 3 ways that we can compost. And pull this up. And there are a couple things we need to do composting regardless of how we do it. So the 4 major ingredients to composting generally are greens, what we call greens. And greens are anything that is nitrogen rich. So it's your food waste. It is coffee grounds. It is, there was a great line that I read actually in an article just yesterday about composting that was saying, if you put it on your counter and it starts to rot, that's probably a green. And some things are the exception, but all of your kind of like food scraps, your produce scraps, those kind of things fall into the green category. Browns are things that if you put on your counter, they dry out. And so they are things like leaves, shredded paper, newspaper, wood chips, sawdust, those kind of things. And you generally need those in about a 50-50 ratio to make good compost. If you have too much of the greens, you'll start to get kind of, it'll be smelly, it'll be slimy, it'll be kind of all the things that you might associate with food that you've left in your fridge for too long. That bag of lettuce that you forgot about that's in the back. Like all those things that happen, those are like because there aren't enough browns to kind of balance it out. And if you have too much browns, then generally what happens is just nothing happens. Like it just takes a lot longer for those things to break down. And so you kind of are shooting for a 50-50 ratio most of the time when you're doing that. I kind of also use the analogy of like, it's kind of like making a gravy. And so you need to kind of mix of the flour, which is the browns, and then the flavors and the juices, which is the greens. And it often 50-50 is kind of generally the standard, but you may need to adjust it based on what you're using. And so another thing I want to say is that if you're going to be doing composting yourself, be prepared to do some experimenting and be prepared to learn some lessons and be prepared to fail a little bit, because that's how you learn how to do it right and do it well and how it will work for you. The other 2 things that compost needs, in addition to browns and greens, are water. So you don't want them to be too dry. It does get some water from the breakdown of the greens, but sometimes if you touch it and it feels very dry, what you're doing, then you might need to water it a little bit. And the other thing is oxygen. So composting is what we call an aerobic process, and that's a fancy word that mostly means it uses oxygen, as opposed to an anaerobic process, which doesn't use oxygen. And so if it's not getting air, material may still break down, but it will start to produce, you'll be able to smell it because it won't smell good. So if you're having smells and you have a good mixture of stuff, it might be that it's kind of too compacted or you're not letting any air get into it. So those are kind of the things you need. Now, if you live in an apartment, it might be kind of hard to get something like leaves or something like that. And so one of the things that a lot of times you can use if you live in the city and you don't have access to leaves, or it's July and you don't have access to leaves that have fallen off of trees, is shredded newspaper is a really kind of good substitute for that. The other thing to just kind of keep in mind with your browns is if you are using wood chips or sawdust, you want to make sure that it's coming from untreated wood. So unfortunately, you can't just go to a wood shop or a hardware store that is, if they're cutting wood there and they have lots of sawdust, if they're mixing their pre-treated and untreated wood, then you don't want to put that kind of material into your compost as well. So that's kind of what you need to get started. And have another picture here that kind of shows the beginning and the end. And I'm going to just do my screen share trick again. Just to have a visual to go with what I'm talking about a little bit. There we go. So this food scraps on one side, and that's kind of what finished compost can look like on the other side. I will caution you, you shouldn't worry if your finished compost looks a little bit more twiggy, doesn't look quite as fine. We screen, so part of our process, one of the last things we do is that we screen compost. So we screen it so that we put it through a screen, and that takes out any of the kind of like larger pieces that might not have fully broken down or other things. Those things generally, that is mostly for, I mean, there are some things that might need to break down a little more, but a lot of that is for aesthetics because we sell the compost. If people want it to look nice, it has a lot less to do with how actually useful the finished material is. If it's a little clumpier or that, it's still oftentimes very fine to use in your gardening. So I do want to caution people about that, because I often get questions that people say, I've been composting for a long time, but I never get it to look as good as like compost that I see that you guys have. And I am like, well, we're cheating a little bit, at least in how, I mean, we're not cheating, but we're screening it so it looks very nice, which you can do, but it's not generally necessary for a home compost. A question jumped in. I'm happy to take it to answer it. I can't see it though.
I mean, you basically just spoke exactly what I've felt about my compost all of these years, is like, it looks so close to black gold, but not, and I can still see the eggshells. So for screened compost before, can you kind of describe what finished compost could look like pre-screening, so I know if I'm close?
Yeah, I mean, it should look like soil, but if there's some sticks in there or some eggshells in there, I mean, eggshells are never really going to fully break down. They're just going to come into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So they're totally fine in there. There's sticks. I mean, what you want to avoid is having stuff that looks like, oh, I can kind of tell what that is still, right? Like, or what it was in its previous life. And if you can't tell what it was in its previous life, and it smells kind of like rich earth and doesn't have any odor and doesn't have any warmth to it, because sometimes compost, when you're making it, will get warm or get hot depending on how you're doing it. Doesn't have any of that, then it's probably fine to use in your gardening, even though it doesn't look as nice as you might like it. The other thing you can do if you want is you can kind of just build yourself kind of a very small, you can build a very simple screen using just kind of wood and hardware cloth. So if you did like 1/2-inch hardware cloth, and then you just you dump it on top, and if it's small enough that you can move it back and forth, you shake it. If it's larger, you can kind of you can build something that you tell your side and you shovel it through, and then you'll get the stuff that looks really nice that goes through, and the stuff that doesn't, you just throw back in your pile. So those are kind of two. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
No problem. Glad I could help there. And so that is, but all that requires, like, you have those ingredients, and then you need to figure out, well, how am I going to compost? And so there are kind of 3 primary ways that you can compost at home. And I'll kind of say at home in quotes, because you'll see about the last one what I mean by that. The first one is if you is using either some kind of bin or container or tumbler. So those are kind of different things, and I'll talk about them, but I kind of lump them into the same category. And the reason for that is because you need to have some general outside space to do that. You may not have to have a lot of outside space, but you do need some place to put these containers. So a tumbler is something And I'll show you guys a picture of that in case you're not familiar. Okay, so these are 2 tumblers. One of them is a store-bought one, and one of them is a homemade one. And a tumbler basically works by you put your material in it, both your browns and your greens, and it spins, and that allows the material to mix together. And it allows it to get air to different parts of it, and after a while, that material will go through its breakdown process, and it will produce, you'll get some finished compost out of it. The next thing I'm going to show you, and I guess the advantage of that is that it is relatively easy to move the compost around, which gets oxygen to all the parts and helps to facilitate the breakdown. The one big problem that a lot of people have with tumblers generally is that if you only have one tumbler and you're constantly putting material in it, you will never have all of your material in there being finished material. So you often need some place where you're kind of a second container or a second tumbler where you're filling it while you're tumbling your other one, so that you're able to harvest the finished material out of there, because composting can take time. If you're doing it on yourself, it's probably good. At home, you're probably going to have 3 to 4 months as your fastest time that you can do it, and much more likely to be, depending on how you do it, 6, 12, or even 18 months before the material kind of breaks down.
We have a question about that from Mara.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't a question. I was just saying, yep.
Oh, I'm sorry. I misread.
I learned that the hard way, so I'm glad he mentioned that, because I had a tumbler and I thought, oh, great. And then we ended up getting a trash can to fill up with extras, and it was kind of hard to find the best rotational system of where to put it to finish. And yeah, it was kind of confusing to set that up.
Yeah, and so that's one of you're speaking to, but that is one of the challenges about using tumblers as a system, and all of these things have their own challenges. And you can build these tumblers or you can buy them. There are a ton of instructions online on how to build them. I will send to Molly, who will send out later to people a whole bunch of links to different resources that for doing composting at home, both kind of traditional composting, which we're talking about now, and also vermicomposting or worm composting, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I will just say them too, because if you're watching this later, then you won't necessarily get those links because you may not have their contact information. The composting at home, one of the best resources is from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And if you just Google ILSR and home composting, they have a whole section of their website dedicated. They've got webinars you can watch. They've got resources. There's just a ton of good material for backyard and home composting there. And then if you're looking for worm composting stuff, which we will talk more about, the University of North Carolina State University has a whole bunch of stuff on its website. If you Google N as in Nancy, C as in Coleman State, worm composting, you will see a whole slew of resources on how you can get started, including videos on how you can build a worm bin, a lot of tricks, a lot of stuff about that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But I wanted to make sure for people who aren't going to get those links that they have that information.
Tim, that's great. And we'll make sure to include those fabulous resources on our website as well, so people can find them at all times at broadwaygreen.com, so we can include them with your video.
Great.
Yep.
So the other thing beside the tumbler, which we talked about, which is like a bin system, and I'll show a picture. You all saw kind of a not very fancy bin system in the picture of me, but a kind of fancier, nicer looking bin system, because aesthetics do matter, is, hold on, let me share. is something that looks like this. And so the idea of a bin behind a three bin system, this is a 3-bin system, is that you have 3 bins so that you can fill one bin, and then you can move material back and forth between the 2 bins, which allows it to be to mix together, allows it to blend your browns and your greens, and also gives it air to all the parts of the piles. And then you have a 3rd bin where you can be filling up for the next time that you're doing. And you can, this is a very, nicely built one. You could do the same thing with, a trash can with holes. You could do the same thing there. Again, if you Google it or you go to the ILSR website, they have instructions and videos on how you can build very kind of simple DIY bins for doing yourself. And they are simple in that they're kind of set up so you don't avoid some of the problem of tumblers of being able to harvest finished material. They require kind of more manual labor. So you get your hands a little dirtier because either with a pitchfork or a shovel, you have to move it back and forth. So that is, I'll stop sharing that. And so the idea behind the bin system is it allows you to move the things back and forth. One of the major disadvantages of the 2 big disadvantages of it is, one, it does require more physical labor. And so maybe you think that's a good thing and you're, looking for a workout and you're going to turn your compost and get your workout that way. It does require physical labor. It also tends to take up a little bit more space than most of the other methods. Obviously, if you're living in an apartment, a bin system like this is not going to be feasible for what you're doing. But you can usually kind of build them relatively cheaply, and they are relatively simple to manage. The things you want to remember, especially if you're living in more urban areas where you're doing this, you never want to have food scraps on the top of a pile that aren't covered. So you always want to be covering, even after you're mixing, you always want to be covering with some kind of either browns like leaves or your shredded newspaper, or you want to be covering with, if you've been doing it for a while, finished compost on the top, because that will make it less, it'll help kind of deal with any odor issues that might arise, because even the best composters occasionally run into some odor issues that are usually pretty easy to manage, but if they're not covered, they will create problems quicker. It also makes it less attractive for animals. Especially if you're in an urban environment, or you're in or even if you're in a rural environment where you have wildlife that is coming into your area, you probably want to additionally use enclosed bins. So you don't want to just do a bin like you saw that's open on the top. You want to have something that you can at the top, and it can be a removable top, so it keeps animals from getting into your system. Is there a question that I saw? Or
Yeah, we have a great question from Lindsay. Lindsay, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question? It's a good one.
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
So I really don't know much about composting or gardening, but I'm trying to learn more. And I was just wondering, so if your compost becomes ready during a season where you can't immediately put it to use for gardening, I would assume you just kind of keep turning it until it's gardening time. Like, will it still be good to use when spring or whenever it comes around?
Yes. So that's a great question. And the answer is absolutely. There are people who, and once it becomes kind of compost, you can also, if you don't want to keep turning it, you can put it to the side and kind of just let it sit in a pile, and it will still be good to use. There are plenty of people who make compost and then age it for a year before they sell it. So you can age the compost, and the material will continue to break down, and there will still be, because really what's in there, that rich microbial life is going to be in there afterwards. So the longer you are able to let it sit, in some ways, kind of like the richer the environment may become for your gardening. And we see it because we're creating compost all year round, 12 months. And the vast majority of compost that we sell between March and June, right? So that's when people want compost, but have compost that we're finishing in July. We have compost that we're finishing in November. We have compost we're finishing in February. And so and based on, we're in Philadelphia, so we have kind of a 4-season climate. You actually get kind of slightly different variations on your compost depending on when we start it, when it finishes, based on the weather circumstances that are around. But yeah, you absolutely, if you're not ready to use it when it's done, then just leave it there. When you're ready to apply it, apply it. The other thing is that everyone thinks usually about applying compost in the spring. It's when they're gardening, that's when they're starting. But if you're going to be using stuff year after year, it's actually one of the best times to apply compost is in the fall. So after, when you're putting your bed or your pots to sleep for the winter, you put your compost on top of them and you let it sit on there over the winter, and it will work its way into the soil, and the water that'll come from the precipitation will help to spread those micronutrients throughout the soil. And then you're ready to kind of just start planting in the spring. It doesn't mean you can't apply compost in the spring, but a lot of people will apply it in the fall. You can also apply it if it's slightly less mature that way. So even if it's not fully done, if you put it on there in the fall, then by the time you get into, depending on where you are, by the time you get to spring, it may have finished kind of breaking down. So that's a very long answer to your very good question.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And so those kind of, and there are also, I mean, the bin systems and the tumblers, like I said, you can kind of modify and make, these are kind of some ones that look a little nicer, but you can kind of modify them however you want. But let's say you don't have outside space. Let's say you're like me before I started, but you don't want to try to start a whole composting business. You just want to compost. One of the best options out there for people who live in an apartment is vermicomposting, or composting with worms. And essentially what that means is you actually are having worms that are eating, the worms will eat your food waste, and they will make worm poop. And worm poop is kind of like super compost. So it's even more rich than kind of the regular compost, because it also has some stuff that goes from the worm, because it passes through the worm system. And it's not smelly. It's not a waste product, the poop. So I'm going to show you guys some pictures of what two kind of different kind of worm bins, so you can get a sense of what space they require. Whoops, I got to share my screen first. All right, so here are the two worm bins. One is a very DIY version on the left.
Don't see them yet. Sorry.
What'd you say?
We're not seeing them yet.
Oh no. All right.
No worries.
Oh, here we go.
Go. Got it.
Got it?
Yep.
Great. So the one on the left is a very DIY version. The one on the right is a very the store-bought version. And you can do either one. And like I said, the North Carolina State has very good resources, including videos on how to build your own. Maybe you just want to buy it. You can see they take up significantly less space. These people, you can keep them on a balcony. You can keep them in your house. They basically, and with them, you don't need as much of the browns. So basically what you're doing is you get the bin and you put bedding in there, which often the best bedding is just shredded newspaper. And you put, but you can use leaves also. You can see, I'll stop sharing, but you can see, but you put leaves in there as bedding as well. And you get a kind of worm called a red wiggler. And it's got a fun name, but one of it has two main advantages for composting in a worm bin. One is that they are voracious eaters. So they can generally eat their body weight in food every day. So, they're small. So a pound of worms would eat a pound of food. But if you think about that in terms of how much food you would have to eat in a day to have that kind of appetite, it can be a little crazy. The other thing is that they don't really like to travel. So there are some worms like your more traditional earthworms or other worms that will travel for miles and miles throughout the soil. These worms generally like to stay in place. They're homebodies, excellent during, they would do very well during the times that we're living in right now. But they, so as long as their environment has food and nothing harmful is put in there, then they will be happy to kind of just stay in one place, and which makes them very good because you don't really want them leaving the bin and crawling all over your apartment or wherever, your balcony or wherever you may be keeping these. You can do vermicomposting outside as well. They tend to do best. You can do it kind of generally from anywhere from 40 to 90 degrees. They do best in like a 55 to 75 degree temperature range. But you can do them outside as long as you're kind of in between those two extremes. They do a very good job, and they produce a very good finished like compost that you can use, and they tend to eat up. So you feed them, and then you cover it, and they eat it, and then you feed them, and they will climb up, and you cover it, and you eat it, and you can do that throughout your whole system. And when you're done, you can take the top, 6 inches, or the one I showed you with multiple layers, you take the top level off. Most of your worms are there, and most of your finished stuff is on the bottom, ready for usage. The disadvantage is that they are living creatures, so they are not a machine. So you have to take care of them. You have to feed them, and you don't need to feed them. If you're going away on vacation for a week or so, although you may not be doing that now, you don't need to. They'll be fine, but you do have to kind of feed them regularly, or they'll die, and then they won't be able to eat any of your stuff. And if you overfeed them, if you give them more food than what they can eat, then your food starts to rot in a container, and then that can create problems of flies or smells or things like that. So it does take it. There's a little bit of a learning curve with them, but once you if you're willing to go through that, and if you're overfeeding them, you can always take a little bit out. If you're underfeeding them, nothing terrible will happen. Just as long as you make sure that the worms are still there, then they will continue to eat, and this will not kind of multiply as rapidly. And they will multiply kind of to their environment. So depending on the size of your container, if you start with 1 pound of worms, they will continue to multiply until they've kind of reached the limit of what their environment can create. They will. One of the other disadvantages to that is that they are not able to handle as much stuff as your backyard pile. So a backyard pile, you generally, for home composting, you don't want to put in meat or dairy, but most vegetables and even grains can be handled there. You will have some problems with things like avocado pits. If you think about things that are very hard, those are tough to break down in a backyard environment. The worms are a little bit more restrictive, so they don't like things like garlic or kind of onion peels. There's some more restrictions about them that make them so you can't do quite as much stuff. But again, if you look at, I would encourage you, if you are interested in them, to go to that North Carolina State website, check it out, learn more about them, and jump into it, because it can be really, really kind of cool. And you can get attached to them like you can to any pet. So, and the big advantage is that you can do it in a small space. So if you don't have outside space, they are very, very doable for that. The last option that I just will mention for if you want to compost your stuff at home and if you want to compost your stuff at home and you're not able to do it now, is to find out whether your city or your town, whether you have a municipal composting system. But if you don't, if there is a drop-off, there are places that will allow you to drop off food scraps for composting. There are also places that have businesses like ours in Philadelphia where they will collect your material and compost it for you. The advantage of the drop-off and the collection stuff is that you don't have to do the dirty work or the hard work if you don't want to. You just put it out and someone else takes care of it, or you drop it off and someone else takes care of it. The disadvantage is that oftentimes you're not going to get all the finished material that you would get if you did it yourself. And you also will, usually, oftentimes there may be a kind of fee associated with it, whether you're responsible for it or whether the municipality is covering it. There's some kind of fee associated for the work that's being done with it. So that's kind of, I just like to throw that in because that is always an option for people. And there are numerous, small enterprises like our own throughout the country in many different cities. If you don't want to live in a place that has municipal level composting or drop off. So I've done a lot of talking, and I know we only have like 10 or some 15 minutes left. So I want to make sure I leave time just to answer any and all compost questions that you have that I have not gotten to yet.
Great. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a lot of wonderful information. I'll start. I see a question from Jacob. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask that one?
Yeah, sure. It's just, do the worms have to be out in the open? Like, should I be leaving them in my kitchen or can I put them in my closet?
You could definitely put them in your closet. They kind of like, they kind of like dark spaces in general. So closets or kind of fine. It's a kind of a balance of where you want them and what's easiest for you, so you're not forgetting about them and that kind of stuff. But yeah, no, closets, you can put them in those kind of areas, definitely.
Awesome, thanks.
Awesome. Great. Lindsay, do you want to ask your question about a good question about filters?
Yes. Hello again.
Hello.
So I'm still trying to figure out exactly, what can go in and what needs to stay out. I'm trying to not use disposable filters for coffee, but we still have some left, so I'm trying to get rid of those. But I didn't know if that material, if I have to separate out the filter when I throw my grounds in compost, or if I can put the whole thing in there. And kind of the same with tea bags. I'm not sure if it's not like a cotton, I guess. I'm not really sure what that material is that it's made of.
No, so that's a great question. Both tea bags and filters, disposable paper filters, can be put in your compost system.
Yay! Okay.
The two things I will add to that is, if you're doing tea bags, make sure they're not tea bags that have staples in them.
Yes.
And if they do, take the staple out, because the staple will not compost.
Right. Okay.
The other thing is that, and this is not just true for kind of these like paper products, but it's true for anything. The smaller you can get things, the faster they will break down. So if you throw the whole filter in there, it will break down. If you dump the coffee grounds and cut the filter into smaller pieces, or cut your tea bag into smaller pieces, it will break down faster, which will help with the system. The smaller the pieces are in your system, this is not just true for tea bags and filters, it's true for watermelon rinds or apples or banana peels. The smaller it is, the more surface area it has for the whole unit, and that will allow it to break down faster. Not necessary, but does help to speed up the process a little bit.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's great. All right, just going down the chat. Miriam, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. If the noise that the construction's happening on my building gets too loud, I will go back to chat. But I've been reading the different types of options for indoor composting, simply because New York City is going through its maybe we'll compost, maybe we won't.
Yep.
And I did not want to deal with worms. So you spoke a lot about that. And is it better that I just get that contraption that you showed prior next to the one that's homemade, so it can do without worms, or what are my options here?
Right. So if you're doing it if you have no outside space and you want to do composting, your worms are really the best option. I'm not. So there's a Japanese method of food decomposition, which is more like fermentation actually than composting, called bokashi. And so that is something that you can look into, that it doesn't involve worms. So that's one thing that you can explore. I haven't done bokashi myself, but I know people who use it and who it does a good job of using enzymes and other things to help break down food waste. So that can be something to look into. Even the one when I showed you the two, kind of like the homemade one and the other one, both those were using worms. So
oh no.
So, but I would, if you're looking for an inside one and you're dead set against using worms and you don't know a friend who has some outside space that you can partner with, I'd probably look into Bokashi. I would probably, there are some very expensive things that are sold in the market that say they do it all inside. I've never used them. I personally would stay away from them, but if you really want to go down that path, you can look at that too. But I would look into Bokashi. It might be more up your alley.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. Jessica, ask about grass clippings.
Yeah, so sorry. I feel like I have like so many greens, but like I don't feel like I have a lot of browns to contribute to my composting. So I'm just trying to figure out like what browns I can use.
Yeah. So probably grass clippings generally are, unless they've kind of, they're greens, unless you have kind of like let them lay out and just kind of like go kind of like die, and then they kind of start to become a little bit more like browns, but really grass clippings are generally considered greens. I would, again, I usually recommend like shredded, either shredded newspaper or shredded black and white, like just plain like printer paper. And that can be a source, like that can be a way to kind of source browns. You want to stay away from like your glossy or kind of higher end stuff. And but newsprint, your standard like printer paper with black and white ink, like you can use that kind of stuff, and that operates as a brown.
And cardboard would work too.
Cardboard would work too. You just often you're gonna have to like cut it into very small pieces. So and you want to make sure, the other thing with cardboard to make sure is that while the cardboard itself will break down, the tape that's on it, those stickers that are on it, that stuff will not break down. It doesn't mean that you can't have it in your pile. It will still be in there. You'll have to pull it out at the end after the cardboard itself has decomposed.
Cool, thank you.
Great. Mara also added egg cartons as a suggestion.
Yep.
Great. Paige, you want to ask about a specific kind of indoor method?
Hi. Yeah. So a few weeks ago, the Times mentioned a version of composting that uses, I think, like coconut peat or coconut core and biochar or like hardwood ash alone in a combination to compost. And I don't know if that's similar to Bokashi or not, but I just wanted to ask if you knew anything about it or its effectiveness, or if it's worth looking into as an indoor option.
So I saw that article in the Times. It was a little unclear from the article. I think that they're actually doing kind of a method that's very similar to Bokashi, and so they're adding that stuff. Again, I can't speak exactly to. I did read that article, but I can't talk more about that. But Bokashi does work. I mean, it's used throughout Asia extensively, especially in like Japan and Korea. So it's certainly something that I would encourage you, if you want to do indoor stuff and you just don't have an appetite for worms, to look into that. I do think there's a little bit more you have to add besides just, there's like some enzymes that you need to add for that. But if you look at Bokashi, then I think that will get you kind of closer to what the article was kind of referencing.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Great. Mara, do you want to ask your questions?
Yeah, I'll try to make it really quick. So first of all, I've always been unclear about this. Obviously for indoor composting, you are introducing worms to the environment. But if you're starting with like a store-bought outdoor tumbler, do you take a scoop of soil that might have worms in it? Do you need to actively introduce worms to it?
So you don't actually need worms for outdoor composting. Like
Okay.
it will break down. If you're using a tumbler or something like that, the material will break down without worms. Yeah, what you can do is if you have a little bit of like soil. I mean, I don't know. Sometimes if you're in the urban environment, that the soil can be compromised. But if you have a little bit of like good soil, you could throw it in there because there's all kinds of other microbiology that is helpful. It's not necessary, and I don't think you need to buy, like, there are all these things that are sold as like compost starters and all of that kind of stuff. I would stay away from those, but yes, if you throw in some soil, then there may be some microbiology that will be there, but it's not necessary if you don't.
Okay, great. I mean, we ended up with tons of worms in our soil, so I don't know if they or in our compost, maybe they found their way through the holes, or there was just like a few in the scoop, but I never know how to tell others to start it. My second question is, have you used biochar in any of your composting systems yet? Do you have anything to say about that?
We don't use biochar in our composting systems. We do use it. So we use it as we do a potting mix blend that we make. And so we use it in the potting mix blend that we make. So we add, the potting mix blends we make is just the compost we make plus a little bit of the worm. We do vermicomposting as well. So some of the worm castings, and then we add coconut coir, which kind of is an alternative to peat moss. We add rice hulls, and we do a little bit of biochar. So we use biochar. It's good stuff. We don't use it in that part of our making the compost. We use it. That sounds
like a perfect potting soil. I was listening to a podcast with Michael Whitman the other day, and his composting system also pushes air in from the bottom, and then it sounds like he puts a layer of biochar on top to make sure the nutrients are staying within the pile, and then he'll scrape them off the top, add more to the pile, and put them back on.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different bio covers that people use. We just use compost as a bio cover, but you could certainly use biochar. Some people use wood chips as well. Like any kind of that, it does help to kind of a lot of what it does is really, if you're blowing air out, is help to contain if there are any smells that would come out. Then it just smells like the nice compost or biochar that you have on the top, and not there's a little patch that was a little sticky, and then you're blasting that out through your pile as well.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem.
Great. For the sake of time, Barbara, I'm just going to summarize your question, asking about, she says there's a community garden compost, and is there a minimum size or height for the pile to compost faster?
If you're doing it kind of like community garden, I think the minimum size you want to do is 3 by 3 by 3, so 3 feet, so 1 cubic yard. And that you go smaller than that, and you can go smaller than that, but it will take significantly longer if you're going smaller than that size. That's a good size if you have the outside space, is that 1 cubic yard reference.
Great, thank you. Great, and John, let's close out with your questions. If you want to unmute yourself, John.
Hey, sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, so I had 2 questions for you. My fiance and I have been Bennett Compost customers for probably a little over 2 years now. We love it. I know we missed 1 or 2 drop-offs and we felt terrible about it, but you guys were super cool about handling it. So my first question is in regards to upgrading a bin size. What is the process and affiliated cost to do so?
So you're asking about our specific, for our service?
Yeah, for your service.
So the standard service is $18 a month. To add a second bin, we use 5-gallon containers. Add a second second $5 container would be an additional $6 per month, and it's just $6 per month per additional container. So in theory, you could have, 8 additional containers and that would be $6 per container per month additionally.
Very cool. Awesome. And then my second question is still in regards to Bennett Compost. My fiance is opening up a juice and smoothie spot in Ambler, Pennsylvania, but we're located in Chestnut Hill, Philadelphia.
Right.
Would there be a way that we could coordinate some kind of commercial pickup at our home address, or would that have to be the drop-off system?
I'm sure we can work something out. Why don't you send me an email? My email is it's very simple. It's just tim@bennettcompost.com. And we can kind of, that'll be a little bit, I'm sure we can figure it out. It'll be a little bit more of a discussion and something that everyone else might not be quite so interested in. So we'll set up something offline to talk about that.
Sounds good, man. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah.
Great. I want to thank everyone in the chat for answering a whole lot of questions that have also been going back and forth, and for spelling Bokashi. So thank you guys. I think there might be another question or two that we have not been able to pull out, but it is 2:01. So Tim, I don't know if you have another minute or two, you might be able to hang around to answer a lingering question.
Yeah, I can just, if we got, I can do a couple more questions.
Right. So let's formally wrap up, and then if there's another outstanding question that you might have, we'll stick around and answer those here. So thank you all again, and a big thank you, Tim, for sharing your incredible knowledge with all of us. I know I learned so much this hour, and I hope all of you did as well. So thank you again for sharing your time and expertise, and thank you to all of you for spending another hour with us today in this green quarantine session. We hope to see many of you next week. Next week we will be taking a turn and going back into the theater and learning about sustainable stage management with a 7-person panel of extraordinary stage managers from some of whom are here in the panel today, or here listening today. We have Marjorie Horn, we've got Hamilton, Wicked, all of your major shows covered, and we're going to be talking stage management. So please join us next week. And until then, we hope you enjoy your week, and we'll see you then. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys. My pleasure.
Thank you, Tim. If anyone has questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away. Maybe we answered all of them after all.
I actually have a silly question.
Okay.
This is Lindsay again. So how you were talking before about how, the longer the material, the longer the compost sits, the richer it becomes, and how, you have different compost that's been sitting for different amounts of time. Do you have people who are really knowledgeable who kind of request a specific age of compost?
No, it's a good question. We don't get that. We do get, the thing we get much more is people who want to know very specifically what feedstocks we use in our compost.
Oh,
so
okay.
We'll have people who, they don't want, some people don't want compost that has had any manure in it.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't use manure in our compost, but we work with the farm. We work with a couple farms, and they will use manure in their compost. And so there are people who don't want compost that has any manure in it. There are people who don't want compost that has had, you shouldn't do this in your home pile, but you can compost animal products. And there are people who don't want compost that has had any animal products in it for their own various reasons. And then you have people who are, so the question we get more is about kind of the specific feedstocks that we're using. And some very knowledgeable people, have questions about other things related to the soil, but we haven't yet gotten something about how long we've aged the compost.
Yeah, it almost, the way you described it, sounded like kind of how wine people are like, I need it to come from this region and be this old for my specific garden. So I was just kind of curious if people are really specific.
Not yet, but as I think people get more familiar with composting and it becomes a bigger thing, then maybe in 10 or 15 years, you may have people who are very sophisticated and want composts that are kind of made from very specific blends and have been aged a certain amount of times, and it would be very much like a wine situation.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
I had a minor freak out last week because I just found out about the dangers of herbicides getting into manure, because horses and cattle will eat hay sprayed with herbicide and it does not age out of the manure. And I just got a big pile of aged manure, spread it all over my garden, and it just destroys the crop. You have to throw the whole thing out, fortunately. And I covered that manure with hay, and I wasn't sure if the hay itself had been sprayed, and that will destroy your crop. So I can understand why people are calling, because I know that I will be calling any supplier in the future going, hey, what herbicide did you use? Do you know what your hay supplier used? It's devastating to see people's complete crop destroyed.
Yeah, and even within animals, so cow manure, because cows have multiple stomachs, cow manure tends to do a much better job of breaking stuff down, whereas horse manure will often have all kinds of seeds from whatever plant they were eating. And so you may get a crop of, in addition to, if you're using horse manure, in addition to your tomatoes and whatever, you may get some hayseed that's in there or something else.
Oh, absolutely. I can't wait to see what volunteers pop up. We used goat manure last year, and we just have squash everywhere because they eat the pumpkins, like everyone from the community brings their pumpkins at the end of Halloween. And so then you just have pumpkins sprouting up everywhere, which is pretty fun. It's better than hay, I'd say.
Pumpkins, your gourds and tomato seeds. We will almost always, in like the corners of our piles that don't quite get as hot as everything else, we almost inevitably every year we have some squash that grow, we have some cherry tomatoes or something that grow. Those seeds will survive. Like, you really have to hit your temperatures to stop those seeds from germinating. But then maybe you get some tomatoes.
Right, exactly. It can be good. What temperature are you trying to hit to get your compost cooked?
So because we do aerated static pile, the aerated static pile method and the way we do it, we're shooting for 72 consecutive hours of 145 degrees temperature. You will almost assuredly not be able to hit those temperatures in your backyard pile because you're not doing it on the volume. Like, you're losing too much heat. Even if you have the same amount of microbial activity, you're losing too much heat to the atmosphere.
Okay, got it. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
So we're about to introduce chickens into our homestead situation. I'm just curious what suggestions you have for a compost setup when you're adding chicken manure to the mix.
I think I'm just oftentimes mixing the chicken manure in with straw or some kind of bedding. I think is kind of helpful to balance it out. I would not put it on the top. I'd work it into the system. You could also depending on where your compost pile is, you can let the chickens kind of like range around your compost pile. They'll actually take care of a lot of, if you like, gnats and other things that you might have around there. So they can actually kind of be a beneficial in that way as well to a compost system.
Great. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to do that, just how to location-wise set that up. But good to hear you say that.